Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar titled U.S. Climate Resilience Strategy, Prospects for Congressional Action. Thank you for being here with us. My name is Janie Bavishi, and I'm a Senior Advisor in the New York City Mayor's Office. I most recently served as the New York City's Resilience Director under Mayor de Blasio, and before that as the Associate Director for Climate Preparedness at the White House Council on Environmental Quality under President Obama. I'll be moderating what should be an informative and timely conversation with wonderful speakers on the federal government's role in building climate resilience, including what has been done and where we go from here. Today's webinar is convened by the Resilience Roadmap, a project hosted by Duke University that brings together leading resilience experts to offer actionable recommendations to inform the federal government's resilience efforts. The webinar is sponsored by Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions and the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. Before we begin, there are a number of logistics to go through. Please feel free to use the chat to share your name and organization, as well as ideas, resources, and experiences that you may have throughout the session. In addition, we have a Q&A box that is meant for questions for the presenters. Please use the Q&A box to ask those questions, which we'll be monitoring throughout the session. We already have many questions submitted during the webinar registration, which we'll also be referring to. We will do our best to get through as many of those questions as possible. We are recording the event, and we will have the recording available with closed captioning in the coming days. If you need closed captioning now, please click on the closed caption button on the icon ribbon at the bottom of this Zoom screen. If you are having any technical issues, please send a chat to either Rachel Karasik or Sarah Mason, who are helping with this webinar. For the first 15 minutes or so, we'll have a discussion with two individuals who have been leading the efforts to engage policymakers on building climate resilience for years. And then we'll be joined by Congressman Curtis and Peters. Allow me to introduce our discussants who will help us kick off today's event, who are members of the Resilience Roadmap Steering Committee. First, I'm really excited to introduce Zav D'Souza Briggs. Zav is a senior fellow at Brookings Metro, as well as senior advisor in shaping and implementing the team strategy for impact from the federal to the local level, and aligning public and private action, including business and philanthropy, for an inclusive and climate-smart recovery. During the Obama administration, Zav was Associate Director for General Government Programs in the White House Office of Management and Budget, and served as the Acting Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at HUD during the Clinton administration. And Sally Erickson. Sally was also at OMB during the Obama administration, working as the Associate Director for Natural Resources. She was also the Associate Director for Natural Resources at the White House Council on Environmental Quality during the Clinton administration. Sally currently serves as a strategic consultant for nonprofit environmental organizations and foundations on climate resilience and climate policy, natural resource conservation policies and programs. The theme of our discussion today is the need for a national resilience strategy for the U.S. We will soon be joined by two of the congressmen that have co-sponsored a bipartisan bill, the National Climate Adaptation and Resilience Strategy Act, or NCARS. I want to take a few minutes with both of you, Zev and Sally, to set the stage for our discussion. But first, let me give a quick overview of NCARS before we begin. NCARS is the most comprehensive legislation proposed to address our nation's climate resilience building needs. Representatives Scott Peters and John Curtis co-sponsored NCARS in January, along with Representatives María Salazar and Lisa Blunt Rochester. Senators Chris Coons and Lisa Murkowski are sponsoring it in the Senate, appointing a president who would oversee the development of a national resilience strategy for nationwide integrated efforts connecting federal, state, and tribal agencies and efforts, and interagency working groups for whole of government coordination. So Sally and Zav, I want to turn to you to start off our conversation here. The Biden administration has come in with a strong commitment to building climate resilience and to do so in an equitable manner. Yet we see daily more staggering news on climate-driven disasters, such as the heat waves that we saw last week and are continuing on, as well as another year of extreme wildfire and droughts. And we know that the big climate plan that we had been talking about hasn't materialized quite as we expected. Sally, can you describe where agencies have been focusing their efforts and give us some examples of some of the successes in the last year or so?
Thanks, Janie. It's great to be doing this. There's a lot of activity across the federal government in two major focuses. One is to protect the federal government investments and assets over the long term, and then also to integrate climate resilience planning into federal policies and plans out in the field. Agencies are appointing chief resilience officers who are developing plans for their agencies. A good example is what the Department of Defense does. They use their climate intelligence to figure out which of their installations are most at risk, and then figuring out strategies to protect those assets. There's resilience criteria in grant making in the Department of Transportation, for example. Where there is flexibility, they're trying to make sure that the transportation funding will be resilient for the long term. We're spending billions of dollars to reduce wildfire risk in the West, to reduce the load in rural areas, and increasingly climate's being looked at in agencies that you don't normally think about. We're thinking about resilience, like the health agencies are worried about the impacts of smoke in public health. There's been a lot of effort to organize resilience inside the government. There's lots of interagency working groups to coordinate plans across agencies. As Zev and I know, that's really tough work. But there are a lot of interagency things. A lot of this work isn't obvious to the outside. They're still working on things, and a lot of it's not very glamorous, like getting agencies to use the same science as they do their planning. So but there really is activity across the board. It's just some agencies are moving faster than others. Some are wrestling with issues that they've been thinking about for decades on how you actually think about planning in a new environment where we have real risks.
Thanks, Sally. That's really helpful context. I want to turn to Zev. Zev, the Resilience Roadmap's new policy brief reviewing progress on U.S. resilience efforts and providing recommendations for how the federal government could further amplify and accelerate progress came out today. And I wanted to turn to you to ask you, what are your key recommendations and how could they overcome current issues limiting our progress?
Well, Janie, thank you. And it's great to be with you. Great to be in this conversation today. There are a couple of main messages to the Resilience Roadmap that we're releasing. And the first is just a big reminder, right out the gate, that the impacts of climate change are not just a concern for future generations. They're here now in the things we've been naming: extreme drought, heat, flooding, more intensive storms. We're seeing the costs and the risks all around us day by day. And that's one reason, we also underline this as a framing point, that we see real bipartisan support out there in the public and among stakeholders. The public wants action on this. So that's a fundamental place to start. And it comes as great news, of course. And we have seen some progress too. And Sally talked about some of it at the federal level. But we haven't done enough. And we outlined some of the biggest things that have yet to happen. We're excited, of course, about the bill that we'll get into in just a moment. And we outlined a number of actions that could accelerate progress, like further disclosures about financial risk, the federal government to the nation as a whole, like spending standards, now that we're doing the biggest in a generation infrastructure investment. That's a huge part of the resilience puzzle. But we don't have standards attached to most of that money. We're not looking at that through a resilience lens yet. And we named some other recommendations as well.
Thanks, Zev. Again, very useful context and builds on some of the progress that Sally mentioned earlier. I see that Representative Curtis has joined us. Thank you so much for joining us, Congressman Curtis, and we'll turn to you in just a few minutes. We're going to just finish up a quick conversation with our discussants here. Sally, I'm going to just ask you one final question before we turn to Representative Curtis and Representative Peters, who will join us shortly as well. A key recommendation of the Resilience Roadmap project last year was to develop a national resilience strategy, and that's really a core focus of our conversation here today. The Biden administration has not done so as of yet. And, with this legislation that Congressman Peters and Curtis have introduced, and we'll discuss later, Congress may mandate it. What do you think would be different if we had a national resilience strategy?
I think it's important to do that because you get more focus on resilience across the agencies. You elevate the issue for the policy officials, and you have increased coordination, and you have learning across the agencies. So having a strategy just brings all the pieces that Zab and I've been talking about together in a more coherent way, and a more and more strategic across the all of government.
Janie, could I add a very quick point?
Absolutely.
I completely agree with Sally. Just 10 seconds on this. As an example, we have seen firsthand that having a strategy required, another way of saying, applying a lens, developing a real game plan, the potential of it cannot be overstated. I mean, we did it for Homeland Security after 9/11. We took that lens and we applied it across the government, and we asked of all the budget requests every year, how does this further the nation's Homeland Security? This is another kind of national imperative now. And of course, it's another form of security for families, for businesses, for stakeholders. When you have a mandate to create a national strategy, it begins to get embedded in all of these processes that government is operating every day. And that's incredibly important.
Thanks, for that perspective. Sally and Zab, very useful context. We're going to turn now to a conversation about the legislation at hand, the NCARS bill. And we'll come back to you at the end of the conversation to hear your key takeaways from our conversation with Representatives Peters and Curtis. We are enormously honored now to have Representative Curtis join us. He's one of the key congressmen leading this effort to talk about the NCARS bill and other efforts to build our nation's resilience. As a brief introduction, Representative John Curtis is a Republican from Utah's 3rd Congressional District around Salt Lake City. He serves on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, chairman of the Conservative Climate Caucus, and vice chairman of the Western Caucus. As chairman of the Conservative Climate Caucus, Congressman Curtis is working to educate House Republicans on climate policies and legislation consistent with conservative values. Thank you again, Representative Curtis, for joining us today.
Great to be with you.
Well, we wanted to get right into it and really hear from you, Congressman Curtis. What does resilience mean back in your district? What is motivating you to lead this effort? And what opportunities will be created for your constituents?
Well, it's hard to say everything that's motivating me in just a few minutes, but let me touch on a few things. First of all, I believe strongly as a conservative that it's important to be a good steward over this earth. And I regret that sometimes conservatives, Republicans have not done a good job of expressing that and allowing ourselves to be branded as otherwise not caring. And I just find that's not true. I come from a deeply conservative Republican state, and I can tell you that they do care about leaving the planet better than we found it. And I'm part of the purpose for the caucus that you describe is helping them better articulate that. On top of that, Utah's in the middle of the state's longest drought. The Great Salt Lake is in serious jeopardy of drying up. Who would have ever thought that would even be an issue? Lake Powell in the south is down 150 feet. And of course, we're seeing the impact on dry forests and forest fires. And so we're living a real reality of changing climate and the problems with that. And all of those, quite frankly, are very motivating to engage and see if we can't find solutions. I hate the radio silence. Are you waiting for me, or are we?
I apologize, Representative Curtis. You were breaking up for me, so I'm not sure if
Oh dear.
my
Okay.
end or your end. Well, let me
let me try an adjustment here and see. Yeah, is it still not clear for you?
It is now. It is now.
Okay.
Well, let's move on to the bill. You have introduced the National Climate Adaptation and Resilience Act, or NCARS for short. I had a chance to speak a bit about NCARS right at the beginning to just highlight some of the major components. But NCARS is particularly notable, I think, because it's not only bipartisan, but also bicameral. Tell us about this bill and why it's important.
Well, let me, and I don't know if Representative Scott Peters is on with us yet, but I've got to give a huge shout out to Scott, who operates in such an incredible way of bringing a bipartisan support. It makes it easy to work with. And we share many common goals and are pretty frank about talking about how we break through our differences and the differences maybe in our parties on certain issues. So it's a real honor to be part of this bill with him. And you may not have been able to hear it, but we're dealing with some really extreme conditions in Utah. And the science tells us that even if we were to stop all greenhouse gas emissions, let's say today, right, if we could somehow wave a wand, the trajectory is still warming, and it's going to take some time before that trajectory changes, even if we stopped all greenhouse gas emissions immediately. And so learning how to deal with that and starting to make better decisions about what we do with that trajectory is critically important. And I'm pleased to be just a small part of that discussion.
Thank you, Congressman Curtis. And I see Congressman Peters has also joined us.
Unfortunately, not in time to hear all the good things I said about him.
Sorry, a little problem with my link, but thanks for having me. It's good to see John. He's a good man too.
Congressman Peters, thank you for joining us. Let me just introduce you very quickly here. Congressman Peters is a Democrat from California's 52nd Congressional District, which covers much of central San Diego County. He is a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee and the House Budget Committee, as well as the Joint Economic Committee. Thank you again, Congressman Peters, for being here. Congressman Curtis gave us a bit of an overview of the NCARS bill and talked about what resilience means in his district. Would you like to talk a bit about, what is motivating you to lead this effort? What opportunities this bill would create for your constituents?
Sure. Well, I'm very much charged with representing San Diego. We sometimes say that representative is both your job title and your description. I led an effort some time ago to figure out what climate change means for San Diego. And there are three main impacts. One is sea level rise. Obviously, we're an ocean community. Another is extended droughts, which will be a challenge for all of California in the West. And the third is more intense wildfires. Wildfires, actually, you wouldn't think of San Diego as necessarily a forested place, but we've had fires come up a couple times at the interface of the urban lands and the wild lands, and take out homes in pretty serious ways in pretty urban areas. So we're very concerned about that. My background is as an environmental lawyer. I practiced environmental law for 15 years before I entered into public service. And so I've taken it on myself to see what we can do to make sure that we address these issues. In particular, John's helping me on an effort that I'm leading with Kevin McCarthy and Bruce Westerman, Bruce is a Republican member from Arkansas who happens to have a advanced forestry degree from the Yale School of Forestry. We're trying to save the giant sequoias in California. Over the past 2 years, if you can believe it, we've lost 19% of all the sequoias in California to fire. They were relatively impervious to fire. In fact, we hadn't lost one for 750 years until 2017, just because of the way the forests are not managed. We're facing this problem. So we have a general interest in sea level rise and the impacts of climate change, specific interest in wildfires and water supply. So that's why I've taken on myself to be involved in this.
Well, thank you both for your leadership on this. What do you both see as the prospects for action on climate resilience in Congress? Do you think we'll see action this year, or is this really more about informing the debate for the next Congress? And maybe I'll start with Congressman Curtis here.
Yeah, so we were all a little bit taken off guard yesterday with the announcement on the Senate side of the reconciliation. Scott's smiling. I don't know if you were as surprised as we were, and it's it's so recent. It's just really hard to factor in. Like, first of all, what's everything in there, and how will that impact it, and will it get passed? But clearly, it's a pretty significant piece of legislation dealing with climate. And so I don't know, Scott, if you can weigh in better about its chances of passage, and if you know a little bit more about it, what's in there. But it's clearly, regardless of your political affiliation, going to put a lot of topics on the table in the next coming months. It may very possibly eclipse every other issue that we're working on for the next few months. It's very possible. Scott and I are working on a data privacy bill in energy and commerce, and it may be that that's now off the table, because this is going to be the big thing in the room for the next several months. I'll let Scott kind of weigh in and see. Here again, it's so new, both of us may not really have a lot of information, but I don't know what you've got, Scott.
Well, it is a Senate bill. So, and John, I found out about, like you do, these have been discussions between really two senators, Schumer and Manchin, that have led to an agreement. Now, I would say I'm going to wait till it has 50 votes to make sure that that it's coming over here again, because I know that there's at least one senator who's been active, and she was not involved at all. So whether there have to be changes to this or not, I'm not sure. My perception is that the $369 billion that would be invested in climate is not a subject of this agreement. That if we get anything around climate, it will be this bill. And mostly these are investments in incentives for transitioning away from fossil fuel for energy, and to carbon capture and things like that. So I think I think it would be to the good. I think maybe in another format, these are the kinds of things that would be bipartisan. I don't expect Republican votes on the reconciliation bill, because there's a lot of things in there that probably are subject of disagreement. And it does include some methane fee, which I think is really important advance too. So I'm rooting for it. I'm just not going to get too excited until I hear that there's actually 50 votes coming out of the Senate.
Well, thanks for raising it. I know it's the topic on everyone's mind. But I think what really turning our conversation back to resilience, I think what really sets resilience apart from some of the issues covered in that package is that it is garnering bipartisan support, where many other climate issues have had partisan divisions. How do you think resilience can serve as a basis for more bipartisan cooperation to address our urgent priorities in strengthening our defenses to extreme weather events, bolstering infrastructure, while building community level resilience and equity?
Can I take a shot at that?
Sure.
I do want to thank, first of all, I think there was a time when I would have characterized a lot of Republicans as in denial about this. And I want to credit John for really coming to the table. He is really a person of good faith, trying to come up with answers. And here's one where we agree that adaptation and resilience is something that we can work together on. A unified plan, position in the White House, a chief resilience officer. This is also, I think, I think we may be the only G20 country without this kind of function. And so we have to prepare our communities for tomorrow's natural disaster. And I think working together so that the federal government is most effective and efficient and dealing with these challenges of adaptation, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I'll be happy to talk a bit more about some of the other bipartisan opportunities that we have. But really the fact we have John and Lisa Murkowski and Congressmember Salazar from the Republican side coming to the table. The problem on my side is often that we fantasize about how quickly this change can happen. I think a lot of the activists among Democrats have to be more realistic about what the numbers are and what the map looks like to get to a transition. But I think progress is good on bipartisanship and resiliency in some other areas as well.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And thanks, Scott, for his kind words. We both deal with parts of our party who, let's say, for lack of a better word, may be extremist in this. And I think it would surprise you how many just good men and women are in Congress who wake up in the morning and say, look, how are we going to see eye to eye on this? I received a text from Scott a couple of weeks ago, and it prompted a meeting that we'll have in a couple of weeks with another Republican. And there's just a lot of good members of Congress on both sides trying to find a path forward on this. I think resiliency is a really important bridge. As Scott was clicking off the things that he's experiencing in San Diego, but for the rising sea levels, I'm relating to everything. I do find myself saying, hey, if those sea levels go high enough, we'll have beachfront in Utah. But other than that, we're quite aligned on forest fires, right, on drought and all of these impacts. And, you know, when we go back to our district, we have to answer for this and what we're doing about it. And I think more and more for Republicans being asked hard questions about what we're doing about the state's longest drought, you know, what we're doing about water and things like that are good motivations and incentives to engage and see if we can find some good bipartisan answers.
Thanks for that. I want to turn to some of the audience questions. I think both of you have alluded to the fact that there is demand from your constituents for resilience action and already good work happening at the local, state, and tribal levels. What are your thoughts on the role of federal governments to support state, local, and tribal level resilience offices and initiatives? And this question comes from Elizabeth Albright from Duke University.
Well, Scott, I'll jump in this time first. And I was a mayor. Scott, weren't you? You were in local government too, I think.
I was a city council president in San Diego.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, we're making a huge mistake if we overlook local government in the solutions to this. And we need to be listening to them. We need to. Many of them have implemented programs and things in their cities that we should take a look at for a national basis. And I just, as a former mayor, I know many of our secrets are held at the local level, and we'd have a lot to learn here on the federal level. And we should be careful that what we do here doesn't supersede their efforts. And I'll give you one quick example. Water usage in Utah is a big deal. And for many years, our water rates were very, very low. And people were not motivated to save water on watering and things like that because it was all but free. So local efforts have been to raise those water rates up to make that more costly for people. And yet there are efforts on the federal level to subsidize water for low-income people. And you can see the conflict there, right, of federal perhaps undermining the efforts of local government. So I think it's really important that we're in harmony and that we're watching and paying attention to what they're doing and complementing what they're doing and not making it more difficult for them.
Yeah, I agree. There's a role for funding by the federal government, sometimes as an incentive for the local governments and state governments to do the right thing. John points out an instance where, you know, the Utah community might be able to try and use the markets to conserve, and we don't want to undercut that. The thing I'm struggling with in San Diego right now is, you know, San Diego is really committed. San Diego, over the last 30 years, the region has done a lot about water security, conservation, providing different sources, desal even. What right now we're engaged in an effort that I started working on when I was on the city council some years ago to do really recycle all of our water. This is black water recycling, not just for irrigation, but for drinking. Rather than, you know, flushing a lot of it down into the ocean, we're going to recycle it. All water is recycled. You know, sort of the catchphrase is we're all drinking Cleopatra's bathwater. It's all the same water. And we've finally got political support for it locally, but we have to get an amendment to the Clean Water Act to let us do that. And so it seems ironic and bureaucratic, but that's what I'm working on here. We have a waiver not to do secondary treatment because we sent our wastewater so far out in the ocean, it was deemed not to affect the ocean. Now we don't want to do it anymore, and we're having a hard time with the Clean Water Act. So part of it is dealing with some of the irrationality that I think John saw in another context with the water rates. There's no reason why that can't be bipartisan and supportive of the local effort.
You mentioned funding as an important federal role. What ways do you think Congress and the federal government as a whole can work to increase the technical capacity of communities that typically struggle to access federal funding opportunities? For example, FEMA's BRIC program represents a large opportunity for pre-disaster mitigation projects, but has also developed a reputation for being challenging to access. What steps do you see being taken to streamline and improve access to that kind of federal funding or federal support? And this question actually comes from Yori Hook, who's a Duke MPP candidate.
John, you want to try that one?
I was hoping Scott would take that one. What came to my mind, this is probably not the person who's asked the questions main point, but what came to mind is the way the federal government has funded water projects over the past years, particularly in the West and in my state. And the federal government has been involved in a number of water systems, loaning the money to state governments, and then the water users pay that back over time. It's a marvelous system that's allowed, for federal funds to be used, but paid back. I've wondered before, Scott and I talk a lot about methane, and I've wondered if we couldn't use a similar program to help municipalities build infrastructure to capture methane from their water treatment and sewage and their dump facilities, because there are a lot of methane's coming off of those. They don't have the resources to build the infrastructure. So maybe a little dose of creativity on how we look at funding from the federal government, how we maximize. We've got a limited amount of money. How do we maximize it and make sure what we put out there, as I understand it, this reconciliation bill does a lot for incentivizing certain things that we'd like to see happen. Are we incentivizing the right things? For instance, going back to methane, Scott and I need to find a way to incentivize small users, small wells to capture their methane. And what role is there for the federal government in that, and incentivizing that and helping them do that? I think those are all really important questions.
I don't have a particular answer on that program, but sometimes we often come across instances where people are having a hard time breaking through the bureaucracy. And I would actually say calling your Congress member and letting them know about that is one way to do it. But if someone wants to send me an email about a particular program, I'm happy to look at it. There's very commonly an effort in Congress as part of lawmaking to follow up on the law that's been made to make sure that it's known and accessible. So it's not an uncommon question. I just, in this context, I don't have familiarity with that, with access to issues to that program. So I'd like to hear more about it.
Great, thank you. Focusing back on the legislation itself, the NCARS legislation, who are the stakeholders you think are most vital to ensuring the success of the legislation and the resilience plan? And this question comes from Lexi Schultz from the American Geophysical Union.
Scott, why don't you jump in on that?
I actually think I do want to start with one of the places I think there will be the most resistance, which is inside the government itself. I have been impressed with how difficult it is to move people from the lane in which they're in, the sort of bureaucratic lane. And so I don't want to minimize the difficulty of getting all these different people who are focused this way to look sideways at each other. And I think that would be difficult. I actually think that might be the main challenge, because I don't see a lot of resistance politically to this idea. And you can see that reflected in the kind of wide support for this and bipartisan support. In terms of what to do for resilience, I think there's going to be plenty of opportunities for people who are in geology, oceanography, design, to participate in that. And I also think that there's going to be a lot of effort to get local site-specific input. So again, this might be an instance going back to the last question about where we have to get the word out that these questions are out there and we need input on that. But so I guess that would be it. I would say getting the bureaucracy to cooperate with a new approach is not nothing. And then really trying to engage people and wide net in a site-specific way, because each place will be affected differently, will be the next challenge.
Yeah, and I wouldn't add a lot to that, but the site specific is critically important. As I talk to different members, I'll find some are motivated by forest fires, some by rising sea levels. And there's parts of our country that when I say forest fires are a big deal, they look at me like I'm crazy. Like there's parts of the country when I say drought's a big deal, they look at me like I'm crazy. But you say rising sea levels and you have their attention. And I think it's important to deal with people on a level where they're hearing it from their constituents, to engage them and not just assume that they get what it's like to be in Utah or to be in San Diego.
I'd say one more thing too. In the context of what we've all deemed a crisis, remarkable to me how a lot of the process that we put people through takes so much time. And when we know as a scientific matter what has to be done, I'm going to argue for less process and less litigation, and trying to put a premium on getting things done faster. One of the really interesting things that's happened in discussing sequoias is how little trust there is in the community for what all scientists agree there has to be restorative thinning and even controlled burns. We can't have a piece of litigation over every project. So that's another set of ears we're going to have to get past. And I think in the context of what we say is a crisis where we only have so much time, it's a really reasonable thing to think about what the appropriate environmental review is on all these things. We have to figure out a way to make it high quality but faster. And I think that's also going to be a challenge for a lot of folks.
Yeah, and continuing on the topic of the legislation, we have a question from Yoga RDD Roca, who's actually a member of the Resilience Roadmap Steering Committee. She said, she's from Florida and she appreciates Congresswoman Salazar's support on this bill. Florida is obviously on the front lines of rising seas. And she was wondering if Representative Curtis, you had reached out to other GOP members or from Florida or other Democratic members for that matter to also ask for their support.
So you've given me the perfect lead in to talk about what I like to talk about the very most, and that is our effort to engage Republicans in this conversation. We just a little over a year ago, we formed an organization, a caucus here in Washington, D.C. It's called the Conservative Climate Caucus. And its whole point was to get Republicans at the table to talk about this. When we started this, we thought we'd have a couple dozen members join because the first tenet is that the climate's changing and Matt's had some influence on it. And Scott, will acknowledge how difficult it's been to get Republicans to get that far. Well, imagine that caucus is now the second largest caucus in Washington, D.C., a group of Republicans talking about climate. It's third of all House Republicans who joined that caucus. And so I do spend a considerable amount of my time, not just in Florida, but with every Republican, recruiting them to join this effort. We don't take a specific approach. Our goal is to educate members on climate issues. And for instance, just this morning, we had a breakfast and we talked about natural gas and carbon sequestration. And so it's been a lot of fun. And so to the person who asked that question, I am relentless getting members to Republican members from every state. And we have a lot of good members from Florida as part of this caucus. I'd have to look up to see exactly which ones, but it's now a very big caucus and a really important caucus, because Scott can have all the great ideas in the world, but unless we can bring some bipartisan support, we're not really going to make big changes. And so I think this is a big deal for us to get ourselves at the table, to bring constructive ideas of our own. We were really good at telling everybody what we didn't like for a long time, and have not been so good. And Scott's enjoying that because it's very true. But we want to get to the point where we're saying, okay, we don't like that idea, but here's our idea. Or look, we can embrace that if we could do this, right? And that's where real progress gets made in Washington once you get to those type of discussions. So working hard on that, we'll continue to work until we get every Republican in there. My dream is someday we actually have Democrats who want to join the Conservative Climate Caucus, but for right now, we'll work on getting Republicans in.
Don't tempt me, John. I'd love to be in those meetings, but I don't think you're letting me in just yet. But I would say, look, this is actually a really important, profound move for climate policy, actually in the country and the world. And look, they're not going fast enough for me. I think we got work to do in getting legislation together. But I would say this: the country has never dealt with any major challenge, whether it's a world war or sending someone to the moon or fighting a pandemic, with one political party. And so for this to be durable and to be effective, it has to involve both Republicans and Democrats. And from my side, I would say too, if you look at the Green New Deal, like the notion we can pretend that natural gas is going to go away tomorrow is almost as damaging as denial of climate change altogether. I mean, the fact is that if you saw what happened with energy prices, the pressure was to use more oil and gas. So we've got to come together on a political consensus, a literal roadmap, a timeline of how to get from where we are to a net zero economy, and what the components of that are going to be. But we can't be in dreamland that it's going to happen overnight through wishful thinking. It's going to be really hard work. It's going to involve science, chemistry. It's going to involve a lot of communication, and it's going to involve Republicans and Democrats if it's going to be durable. So I'm with John. I'm rooting for John. I said, John, just like push him a little bit harder, a little bit faster. But I think the fact that he's got this group together talking about climate with that, understanding up front that the climate's changing and humans are affecting it, I think is really fundamental, important, and welcome.
Scott, it probably won't surprise you to know that I join in your impatience. And yet, on the other hand, we have to say, hey, look, that's a pretty big step in the last 12 months. But I agree. I wish we could move a lot faster. And I think there's hope that we can move quicker in the future. And at the same time, I think part of our problem is we don't stop and celebrate our successes enough and realize just how far we've come. I love to point to the Energy Act of 2020 as really significant, but we hardly even slowed down to celebrate. It's a pretty big deal.
Right. There's some big things around hydrofluorocarbons and carbon capture that we've done that are really important. We quietly lined up with the Kyoto Agreement without talking about the Kyoto Agreement, and that's okay with me. I don't care. Like I said, I don't care if you say birthday cakes cause climate, as long as we get the bill to the president.
Well, Congressman Curtis and Congressman Peters, thank you so much. I think this is a great note to end on. There have been some comments in the chat about how your bipartisanship, but also just your friendship and partnership gives, the community that's here, the resilience community of practitioners, students, leaders that are out there working on the front lines, hope. And I can certainly echo that. Thank you so much for your leadership, and thank you so much for joining us here today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us. And you forgot to say that I have a Duke education, so that I think that helps too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
See you, John. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Well, we are going to turn back to our discussants. So I'd like to bring back Zav Briggs and Sally Erickson and reflect on the conversation we just heard. Zav, Sally, what are your biggest takeaways from what you just heard the congressman discuss? Zav, I'll start with you.
A few things stood out for me. And first of all, I just really want to appreciate the leadership from both members, from both sides of the aisle. It is incredibly important, as we began to talk about it at the top of the session. I was struck that they underlined the importance of local action and supporting it, local governments being on the front lines as a general matter. We could add to that, working with states, with tribes, with Puerto Rico and the other territories, let's not forget, incredibly important. And that takes a variety of forms, as we know, from experience, from national guidance and national standards and coherent rules to technical assistance, incredibly important. And by the way, R&D, there've been some other developments this week around major investments of federal R&D. it can do things that corporate R&D cannot. It's an important complement to the market. So for all those reasons, federal action is critical, but very often it's most critical where it's supportive. And I think we should underline there that one size will not fit all. These leaders are not saying that, we can take exactly identical approaches all across the country, but we need to move. We need to take action. We need to accelerate. And that was a strong, strong message. We didn't hear as much about the private sector per se. I think it was implicit in a lot of the conversation. And I just want to note that I think a conversation like the one we're having today and the actual content of the NCAR's bill, which is really impressive, and its content's very important. I'm struck that a part of what this would do on a whole of government, on a bipartisan, hopefully, basis is meet and match a recognition that we see growing in the private sector, for example, by leaders in the investment community, that understanding and disclosing climate risks and accounting for them and getting smarter about them is incredibly important. And business cannot simply do that on its own. It's healthy that that's going on, but that is going to be carried out most effectively if it's done between business and government, taking a more coordinated approach, conversation with civil society stakeholders, of course, as well, and higher education. Those are a couple things that stand out for me. And I think the last thing I'd say also was, I think, a little implicit when we talked about communities less prepared, less able with their own resources to act on the challenges we now face. The fact that the risks affect us all and the future is a very dire one if we don't speed up the actions we're taking, doesn't mean we're all facing equal risk, or that we have equal resources to act on those risks. So the issue of equity and fundamental fairness, and placing low-income communities and communities of color at the center of this, that's also something that's it's far more doable if we act on a bipartisan basis and see this become law, in addition to all kinds of things that can go on from the executive agencies, like the kinds of things we're seeing from the Biden team. Those are some things that stand out for me.
Thanks, Sav. What about you, Sally?
So a couple of things impressed me a lot. First of all, the relationship is fantastic. Just watching them talk to each other was very heartwarming, actually. The folks on this call show it just more evidence that there's a growing movement of stakeholders who care about climate resilience. And one of the things that Congressman Curtis said, which is really important, is like having stakeholders talking to members of Congress, and then also just making it really local. So and it's really important for stakeholders to get involved with their members of Congress, and not just the folks that think are going to be their friends who agree with them, but this really clear that there's movement in the Republican side that folks just need to engage with their members to educate them about the issues and just make the urgency really clear to as many members of Congress as possible, just kind of make the path easier to get some stuff done. And also just to make it practical, like folks on this call and other stakeholders know what can get done that's actually practical, and that's really compelling. The other thing is the interesting thing that about the bureaucracy getting in the way of being the stakeholder that was the most difficult is a fascinating comment. I think it really shows how important it is to have bipartisan congressional action to push the bureaucrats, because they do pay attention to the Hill, and congressional oversight is very important. It just kind of gets more. It's really interesting that because they follow what the Hill tells them to do. Part of the impediments are the way things are actually written, but having congressional mandate is important, because this issue is a long-term problem. It's going to take decades to deal with this, and you need to have the congressional action for the long haul, and also congressional action can help the federal government assist communities and states to take action as well. So it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sally, and to you, Zeb, as well. You know, I think you both encapsulated this really well. This has been an incredibly hopeful conversation that we've had today. And I think it really just underscores that resilience offers an opportunity for bipartisan, meaningful climate action now, and coupled with the surprise deal that we all woke up to, you know, I think there's a really unique moment here to you know, reset the US's role in the global climate conversation, but also make sure that we're preparing our own communities here at home for the impacts of climate change that we can't avoid. So I'd like to thank our panelists and discussants, Congress members Peters and Curtis, of course, and Zeb and Sally for providing expertise and time to this valuable conversation. I would also like to thank the audience members for joining us today and for engaging in this conversation and submitting your questions and reflections on the chat. I know that for many of you, climate and resilience are not abstract concepts, that you're experiencing the impacts of climate change in your homes and communities now, and need support from the federal government to build resilience. I hope this conversation provided some clarity on where the government is going and how it can impact you, but also some hope. And as I mentioned earlier, recording of this webinar will be available in the next few days. If you have any questions about this webinar in the meantime, please email the event organizers who will put their email addresses in the chat now. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.